I am so happy and pleased to be able to introduce Cristina as our guest speaker today for our member circle entitled "To Live is to Kill," a starting point for a training as peacemakers, a very intriguing title. Reverend Cristina Moon is an ordained priest in the Rinzai Zen tradition and lives at Daihōzan Chōzen-Ji in Honolulu, Hawaii. Cristina spent 15 years working in various social political movements, including Free Burma and nuclear disarmament. She also helped to build the world's fastest growing platform for online activism called change.org. After graduating from Stanford University with a business degree, she entered the monastic training at Chōzen-Ji, where she now resides. Her training continues in Zazen, Kendo, Sado, which is the practice of tea ceremony, and ceramics, while helping individuals and organizations develop a fighting spirit and ability to stay calm in the midst of chaos. So please welcome Reverend Cristina Moon.
Thank you so much, Myoshin. Can everyone hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I'm just so happy to be here with you all today. So can everyone see my screen okay? It says the title of the talk. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here today. Myoshin and Jeff approached me after I spoke recently, I guess it's a couple of months ago now, at the May We Gather event in Los Angeles. It was the first Pan-Asian, Pan-Buddhist gathering, and it was a memorial really for the 49 days of mourning following the mass shootings in Atlanta. And I think it was, the content of my talk there, I got to speak on the paramita of Vidya, which I translated as spiritual strength. And I think that's what got Myoshin and Jeff's attention. And so in my conversations with them, I said, well, I would love for this group in particular, a group of people who identify as peacemakers in the world, who are doing that courageous work, but who have some grounding in Zen. Let's give this talk a slightly provocative title. So I pulled this from a document, a publication called Zen and Budō, Zen and Martial Arts by Omori Sogen Roshi. And I'll go into it a little bit more, but the title, To Live is to Kill. And I reworked the subtitle a little bit kind of for myself. This reflects what this phrase means to me, that it's a starting point for my waging of peace. And I'll dive into a little bit of what I mean by that. But first, let me just give some background on where I am. Usually what I would do is at this point, I would get up and take the computer outside, but I have my microphone and different things set up right now, and I don't want to interrupt the Wi-Fi connection. But what you would see if I took the laptop outside into our parking lot is actually this view. So this is Daihōzan Chōzen-Ji. Daihōzan means that we're a central headquarters temple in the Rinzai sect, which is a very rare thing. There are about, I think, only about a dozen of them in Japan. And the new Daihōzan has not been created before we were founded. And in 1970, I think established as a Daihōzan in 1979, hadn't been established in 400 years. And there had never been a Daihōzan outside of Japan. So this is significant for a couple of reasons, but the most significant is that we have a method of training in Zen that, one, is independent from any other headquarters temple in Japan. So we're kind of like the seat of our own new line of Zen. And we have a very unique approach to it, which is very much shaped by who our founders were. But here are a couple of the talking points I usually share. We're here in the back of Kalihi Valley in Honolulu. It's, as you can see from the photograph, it's really lush and green. We're in the jungle, but we're only 15 minutes from an international airport, which is pretty amazing. We were founded in the West to bring shugyo, the deepest possible spiritual discipline, to the West. Our two founders, Omori Sogen Rataishi and Tonoi Tenshin Rataishi, really felt that shugyo, this word that has no direct translation in the English language, not yet realized in the West. And so they wanted to I'll speak a little bit more about what that looks like in a minute. But of significance as well for Chōzen-Ji is that we have an unbroken line that stretches back to Japan. And I think most significantly for this sort of monastic training environment, not just a public temple like a Hongan-ji that has services every Sunday, for example, but a place where people are really learning Zazen and doing Zen training in the West. We're one of few, if maybe the only one, that's had continuous people of color, Asian American leadership from the beginning. On a day-to-day basis, we have a pretty rigorous daily schedule that starts with Zazen at 5:30 in the morning. And then there's 2 periods of Zazen in the evening, and usually some sort of martial arts or fine arts class. And that setup, you can imagine, is conducive to developing a local membership. So really, most of our members are local to Oahu. They live in Honolulu or another city on the island, and they come here once, sometimes 3, sometimes 5 days a week, just to do their own training as lay people, still totally engaged with the world. And then a very small number of people will actually come and live here. Either they're local students who are at a turning point and the opportunity presents itself to live in as a lay disciple or sort of a monk who doesn't take the formal vows. So celibacy, money, that sort of stuff. But they're living a daily, very rigorous monastic schedule. So a little bit more about our co-founders, which is all me teeing up a lot of context to explain why we're so weird and why we do what we do. We were co-founded by 2 individuals, Tonoi Tenshin Roshi, who's on the left, and Omori Sogen. Both were Zen masters and both were martial arts masters. Omori Sogen taught 2 sword forms, Hojo, which is a 500-year-old Japanese sword form, a kata, and Kendo. And he was also a master calligrapher. Tonoi Tenshin Roshi, or just Tonoi Roshi, was really remarkable. He was a genius in the martial arts. He achieved 6th and 7th Dan, 6th and 7th degree black belt in 7 different martial arts by pretty rigorous Japanese standards by the age of 32. And just for context for folks who aren't familiar with Japanese martial arts, you know, our Kendo teacher is 65 and he's 7th Dan in Kendo. And that alone people are like, wow, he's 7th Dan in Kendo. It's a lifetime achievement. So if you can imagine 6th and 7th Dan in 7 different martial arts, that's quite significant. And their grounding in the martial arts and this really physical approach to spiritual discipline meant that they infused the training at Chōzen-Ji with this very physical aspect. And we believe that you can approach Zen to transcend life and death, all dualism, through the body. And on the page here, I've just included one line from our canon that Omori Sogen wrote, and that hangs in our Budō or martial arts dojo. Zen is to transcend life and death, all dualism, to truly realize that the entire universe is the true human body through the discipline of mind and body in oneness. So I have been living at Chōzen-Ji since early 2018. I was ordained as a priest in December of 2019. As Myoshin mentioned, I train in Kendo, also that other sword form called the Hojo, Chado, and ceramics. I also, of course, do Okyo and Zazen, which are kind of, I wouldn't say the bread and butter, but they're kind of the basics of what anyone, you know, any good Zen monk would be doing, I think. More recently, I've had the great honor and responsibility of being Tenzo, the person who's running the kitchen and responsible for all the food during sesshin and live-in periods. But somewhat, you know, contrary to what some people expect, and this really goes back to the establishment of Chōzen-Ji as a place to not just bring shugyo to the West for a bunch of monks who live a cloistered life, but actually for lay people who are going to use Zen training to be leaders in the world. Somewhat in line with that, I also work. So I'm a consultant, I'm a writer and a speaker. And previously my paying work, my day-to-day work was more focused on activism and social change. Oh, I missed a slide. There we go. So I had to count again. I said 15 years to Myoshin, but going back is kind of like 20, which just means I'm getting old. 20 years I've spent doing different kinds of social change work. And as Myoshin mentioned, that started out doing organizing, solidarity organizing internationally with the Free Burma movement, supporting democracy and human rights activists inside the country and who were living as refugees and exiles in the border areas or in the West. As part of that work, I also founded a school in Eastern Burma in Karen State for children who had been displaced by armed conflict that targeted the ethnic minority groups, of which the Karen were one. Then after that, I worked for Global Zero, an international movement to eliminate nuclear weapons. And we were really aimed at taking the treetops, folks working at Dr. Fort's level of international policy, and then student activists, people who are still in college, the Model UN kind of folks, who were like, wow, I'd love to sit in the same room with Mary Robinson and figure out what her take is on how to do this and how do I support that work as a young person, a new generation interested in eliminating nuclear weapons. After that, I went on to change.org and I really looked at the technology side of how to scale social change, especially how to take the expertise, so not just the tools like online petitions, but the expertise and experience and relationships of social change work, like campaigning, doing your power mapping, understanding who decision makers were and influencers for a given initiative or campaign. And then, how could I put those tools, that power in the hands of everyday people to create change where they lived? And this ranged in issues from, I want to have backyard hens in Columbus, Ohio, to shutting down gay conversion centers that were essentially places of torture in Ecuador. So they really ranged the whole gamut in terms of how people were using these tools and the issues of social justice and change that really touched their lives. It was very gratifying work. And then much more recently, I've been involved with a wonderful organization here as a volunteer, actually, somewhat dovetailed with my time here at Chōzen-Ji, a group called Hui Aloha. And I should have included a picture, but the most remarkable thing that Hui Aloha has done as completely a group of volunteers is we've supported a village of about 300 houseless, mostly Native Hawaiian folks here on Oahu who have really, or exercising their own self-determination. And we supported them in raising $1.5 million to buy 20 acres of land. And they're starting construction on a whole village that's inspired by Native Hawaiian living and is going to be a collection of tiny homes for literally 250 houseless, mostly Native Hawaiian people to start living on here in Oahu, which is really, really wonderful, gratifying work. And then really most recently, I've been speaking out, and this is the first sort of this was the first time I came out as a Zen priest in my role as sort of in a clerical role, I suppose, or pastoral, to talk about the rise in anti-Asian violence, particularly on the mainland. And so this is a photo. If you look very closely, I'm very small here in the middle with my rakusu on, speaking at the Hawaii State Capitol to a group that was assembled very concerned about the rise in anti-Asian violence. Okay. So Myoshin, I hope it's okay if I share. Myoshin let me know that before the call started that someone did email Jeff protesting the title of my talk, which is good because it was meant to be provocative. And I want to get into a little bit of, what I mean when I say this and where I got it from. It is not mine. So this again came from Omori Sogen Roteshi, who is one of the co-founders here at Chōzen-Ji. In his really seminal work, Zen and Budō, Zen and the Martial Arts, Omori Roshi described in very stark terms. He said that essentially, for a human being to live, we necessarily kill other beings every moment of our lives. So the quotes here that I've pulled out are, even a man of noble and godlike character cannot exist for even a single day without depriving other forms of life of their life. Consequently, even if man really loves peace, in order to attain this noble aim of peace, he must kill the cow, kill the pig, kill the chicken, kill the fish, and kill the vegetables. And that doesn't even begin to touch all the insects and other living beings you might kill by driving your car, by using electricity, the refiner, which goes through a refining process that often unfairly touches communities of color, refugees, and immigrant communities through the refining placed in where they live in their neighborhoods. Oil and gas that you put in your car. So for me, this was a turning point in my thinking about my activism and my work in social justice, social change, to start out with the premise of to live is to kill. I've spent my whole life, 20 years, trying to save other people, trying to bring about human rights and democratic systems in places like Burma, working with refugees, working with children. And when I reflect on sort of where I was at and where I was coming from with that work when I was much younger, it was kind of out of a sense of like, there's a real attachment in my identity to like, I'm a person who does the right thing. And if you look at that from the perspective of Zen and dualism, there's a right and there's a wrong. So there's a very dualistic framework for me of like, I do the right thing. Other people should do the right thing. And if you're not, you're on the wrong side. And that was, it was the source of a lot of suffering for me. And I may have been told that I was doing, noble action, noble livelihood, right livelihood in the way that I chose to spend my time. But in many ways, that core, that seed of the dualism and righteousness, the sense of right and wrong, and I wanted to be right, really engendered a lot of suffering and judgment on my part, alienating and isolating myself in different relationships, making life harder than it needed to be, and probably making me a lot less effective in the work that I was doing. So, when I read these passages for the first time, and I really started to sort of turn them over for myself, I started to wonder, what would it mean if not that I would abandon the work that I did, but what would it mean if I approached it from this place of, instead of, I'm the person who does the right thing that other people aren't willing to do, don't have the courage to do. What if I approached it from this real place of humility of, by virtue of living as a human being, I'm already impinging on so many other creatures, on people, through systems in ways that I can't even fully comprehend or understand or imagine. And what this led me to was a really deep interrogation of, well, who am I really, and what am I trying to do in the world? And as any of you with, Zen training experience know, it was it really disrupted a lot of things for me. I questioned a lot of the things that I thought about myself, my sense of identity, and my story about who I was. And it was hard. It was hard to sit there and sort of face it. And I wouldn't say that most of all the standpoint of like, oh, to live is to kill was the most jarring for me, but it was one of many things that in my training came up that sowed the seeds of the great doubt. Who am I to do this? Can I really realize anything? Can I let go of this baggage? I don't know. And one of the things that I learned maybe about a year or so into my training, I was teaching beginning Zazen. So the first thing you have to do if you want to come train at Chōzen-Ji is you have to be able to sit 45 minutes in Zazen, good posture, breath, concentration, and without moving. So that's often challenging for a lot of people. And it was my job as the beginning Zazen instructor to give them a good on-ramp. So we'd start with 10 minutes, 20 minutes, get them up to 45, so that when they go into the Budō dojo with everyone else, it's not a hot mess. So one day I had this young man come in, and he came with his cousin. And he said, well, his cousin said, I brought my cousin here today because Kazwan was supposed to go to Disney World with his girlfriend. And he got off work a little later. So this romantic weekend they had planned together, she went out ahead. She was checked into the hotel and she was waiting for him over there. And then he was supposed to get on the plane and meet her there. And they were going to have this really special romantic weekend that they'd been planning for a long time at Disneyland in California. He got on the plane, he finished work, he got on the plane, and he was so overcome with anxiety by the prospect of getting on the plane and traveling that he ended up having to get off. His girlfriend was left there stranded in California by herself for this romantic weekend. And that was a wake-up call to him of like, I got to figure this out. I've had anxiety for a long time, but this is too much. This is really impairing my quality of life. And so he came, his cousin suggested, oh, you should come to this dojo. They're really tough there, but I think it could help you. Come learn Zazen. So he sat down. And this was the only time that within 2 minutes of starting the Zazen, he was crawling out of his skin. He was moving. I had to end it. Early. I said, okay, we'll figure this out. And the next time I came up with a strategy. I opened up the windows, the curtains, and I said, okay, anytime you feel the anxiety coming up, you look up, you see the mountains, you see the trees moving, just get your attention somewhere else. And then every once in a while, I'm going to hold my hands up. And that means that everyone else is going to stay still, but you can turn around, you can stretch your legs, and then you can come back and start again. So the first time I put my hands together, he turned around, he stretched his legs. I could feel that it was like a bit of a relief for him. His, anxiety had been building up, made him feel better. But then the second time I held my hands up in Gasho and he didn't move. I was like, oh no, he's so stuck in his head. He's having a panic attack. He didn't even notice that I held Gasho. And so I kind of got worried. And a couple minutes later, I did it again, still didn't move. Third time, I said, you can turn around and stretch your legs. He did, he came back. But then it was a couple more times, he didn't move. And then before I knew it, we sat 30 minutes straight. He didn't move. I rang the bell, I hit the taku at the end, and I said, what happened? He said, I realized that I had to fight. And that was like, oh, maybe that's what everyone at Chōzen-Ji's meant when they keep telling me that our training, one of the outcomes or one of the sort of modes of it is to teach people to have a fighting spirit. It's not to go out and scrap with people, go out and fight with people. It's to have that fighting spirit so that when faced with this really tough challenge, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if this is who I am. I don't know if I can make it. That you still have a source of spiritual strength to push yourself and say, I can do this. So part of the reason that I bring this up is one, because as I was wrestling in my own training, one of the questions being around this, like, who am I as an activist? Is it still what I want to do? What would it mean if I approached it from this perspective or starting point of to live is to kill? Could I have what would I need to get through that struggle, that challenge? And to me, it became really clear it was that fighting spirit that I needed to cultivate that to get through this really thorny, tricky question. So we have two ways of really building this sort of fighting spirit. This, in Japanese, we might also refer to it as kiai. Ki is like the word chi in Chinese, which is in Qigong or Tai Chi. It means your vital energy. Kiai is the way that kind of gets realized out in the material world, the way that you would feel it. So could think of it as an energy vibration, could think of it as presence or countenance. But kiai and fighting spirit, I use like pretty interchangeably. So the best way to develop kiai is zazen, just sitting, not moving, counting your breaths, seeing the whole room 180 degrees in every direction. And then one way of developing kiai, and particularly with that feeling of the fighting spirit, I'm going to go belly button forward into whatever's right in front of me, is through Budō, through martial arts. And in particular for us is kendo. So kendo, as you can see from this picture, you have all this armor, you have this helmet that you've put on, you're holding, not a metal sword, but a bamboo sword. But boy, out of anything that I've done or heard of, this is the closest that you can get to feeling like you're in a real fight. And like every encounter is life or death. There's this guy, he's trying to hit me over the head with something. And then how do I respond in that moment? Do I shrink? Do I run away? Do I try to outmaneuver him and be crafty? Or do I go belly button forward, straight into the encounter? Doesn't matter if I hit him. Doesn't matter if he hits me. I'm still going to go forward anyway. So there are other martial arts that we train in and that are useful from many different angles to sort of get at whatever those habits are, those attachments are to our ego, our sense of identity, and even our self-preservation. And they all sort of approach this in different ways. And I don't think that I mentioned that we also train in the fine arts at Chōzen-Ji. So we have this sort of saying that, I like to repeat, that it's great if you can feel really calm and centered and in control when you're sitting zazen on the cushion, but can you feel that way with a brush in your hand or with a sword at your throat? If you think about boxing, tai chi, karate, aikido, kyudo, they're all really sort of poking at the same thing, the ego and the attachment, but from all these different angles. And it makes it much easier for then us to take that thing that we're practicing and cultivating in zazen every day, but actually take it out into the world. One way of thinking of it is that we're stress testing it from all these different angles and then able to actually then take that presence out. One of the things that people don't often realize when they're talking about or thinking about the martial arts is that they are not the way that when they're trained in as a way to realize your true self, it's not about developing mastery and technique. Kendo means the way of the sword, which is different from kenjutsu, which is the techniques of swordsmanship. Judo is different from jujutsu, just in the same way that ikebana, flower arrangement, is not the same as kado, the way of the flower. There's a way to transform any discipline or form into a way to realize your true self that really does poke at what are my attachments, it surfaces my attachments, pokes at my ego, and helps me train in my body through muscle memory and even through kiai memory. Okay, how do I throw that away again and again, that small self, that ego? And so when you approach martial arts or fine arts that way, but martial arts in particular, they're training you to get to a point where you've cultivated something about yourself, your kiai, your countenance, your presence, your influence, soft power even, so that you win the conflict without fighting. You're able to, there are all these parables that are not quite koans, but that twist your brain in a similar way of like achieving the ends that you're looking for, the action of non-action without actually doing anything. And in particular in martial arts, it feels like so contradictory, which is why it's so juicy of like, well, I spent all this time like learning the technical aspects of like how to win in a fight. What does it mean to cultivate myself so that I win without fighting? And then it becomes a little easier, I think, when you through that perspective to really internalize, I think, a concept that more people are familiar with, which is Wu Wei, the action of non-action. Another way of saying that is to do nothing and nothing remains undone. And I think a lot of us have heard this and thought about it conceptually in our Zen training and studies, but maybe don't know what that feels like and don't have ways of practicing and training in it over and over again. And so that's where forms, whether they're fine arts or martial arts, are really helpful. And in my experience, the martial arts have been most helpful. What I came to finally with this like starting point of, and I'm still working through it, but you know, if my goal in life, my ultimate purpose is to help create peace and positive change in the world, to start for myself from this starting point of to live is to kill. I acknowledge that I kill vegetables, I kill living beings in the day-to-day, execution of my daily life. I disadvantage other people in ways that I don't know through the resources that I consume. I make mistakes. Sometimes I'm mean or I'm bossy or cut people down. I choose to work on some issues and not others. So I start from that point as like not just really humbling, in opposition to or in contrast to that point, starting point of like, I'm the person who does the right thing. Then I'm challenging myself over and over again. If that's where I'm starting, that by virtue of living as a human being, I am depriving other beings of life. What can I do that's going to make my life worth living? That justifies, what can I do that justifies? How can I live my life in a way that justifies that toll? It cannot come down to just the logistical sort of like material actions that I take. Part of it has to be the other aspects of Zen training, great faith, for example, but also really embracing this idea of myo, mysterious wonder. I may not know the different ways that I impact the world, and maybe there are no scales to tip that go from I'm a burden on the world to I'm a positive impact in the world. I have to, there has to be some work on my part to cultivate myo, this mysterious wonder or synchronicity, things that feel like they're connected and significant, but not in ways that are driven by causal logic. There's meaning and there's significance and purpose sort of caught up in that. And this goes back to like the action of non-action, where my greatest contribution maybe as an activist, as someone who's trying to make peace and change in the world, doesn't come from anything that I do, but maybe it comes from who I am, my vibration, my being. So that's sort of, where this all comes back to. So hopefully that person that protested the title of my talk now understands where I'm coming from. Is not a justification. The most important thing is not a justification of, impacting other beings in a negative way. It really is just it's an acknowledgement of what is fact, that's where we're starting from. And if that's the case, then how are we choosing to live our lives? So that's all I've got. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. No, stop sharing.
Wow, that was a powerful new presentation of new perspectives that I didn't really think about before. Really grateful for that. Yeah, doing the right thing. What is the right thing anyway? For whom, right? So that is a question. I'm sure you all have some questions for this provocative presentation. If you have questions, please use your hand or electronic hand. We can wait for a minute and formulate our questions quietly. Feel free to do so. Yes, Ivan. go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you, Christine, by your explanation. I am Ivan from Brazil, Seiko. And I will ask you, like you say, is the martial arts. I believe in the Zen practice, in the life. This martial art is very more important to fight with me. What to think about this goal of the martial art?
Absolutely. The only true opponent is in here. And that's the greatest point to get to in training in martial arts, to realize and to feel that, and to feel like there are moments where you can score a point on yourself. It feels pretty good. Yeah, training in the martial ways as a way to realize your true self, or as part of Zen training, does mean using the martial arts, just like the fine arts. Say, like when I'm serving tea, I want to disrupt, if not eliminate, that dualism of self and other, swordsman and opponent, and even the instrument. So no sword, no person, no opponent, no tea utensil, no guest, no host. And that place of sort of really being able to intuit, not feeling a separation between myself and whoever else is in the encounter. That's something I'm definitely still working on, and is very challenging, but I feel like I get very far away glimpses of it, and I'm gonna keep going.
Thank you for that great question. Dr. Ford.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you, Christina, for a fantastic presentation. I'd wager that you and I probably don't quite see eye to eye on nuclear weapons, but I absolutely loved your presentation, and especially, well, I mean, we do share at least Buddhism, although I'm more of a Soto sect person than a Rinzai person, but my goodness, I really enjoyed your comments, and especially your focus, well, first of all, on the challenge of squaring non-dualism with a very active and impassioned engagement, which is, in my own weird way, I tried to talk about that the other day as well. So thank you for your comments on that. We also share martial arts, and I really appreciated the fighting spirit comments, and I've been very struck. I think you crystallized it very well for me by the ways in which one can bring into everyday engagement with the world something of that kind of structured control, but yet forward-leaning and mindless in a good way engagement that one finds in those sort of breathless points where you just can't think things through in Randori or some other kind of a Budō context. It was a great presentation, and I really appreciate those insights, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Ford, Chris, what Dan are you? Are you any Dan or?
I'm Sandan in a dojo affiliated with Dai Nippon Budokai in Japan.
Wow.
But it's here in DC, but whatever.
Okay, thank you. Jen, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. It was amazing. This is sort of a broad question that is not fully formed, but I'm someone who craves a lot of discipline, and I'm also bipolar, and my motivation level is constantly up and down and up and down. And sometimes I have great enthusiasm for like a high level of discipline, and it feels very satisfying. And then other times I'm like completely depleted. And I'm sure it's completely different in a monastic environment, this idea of discipline. And so I guess my thoughts are, what suggestions do you have for lay people to harness the spiritual power of discipline without getting into rigidity and without burnout? Thank you.
That's the $1 million question. And one that I'm really wrestling with, because what I know is to do this in a monastic setting. And I know that there's benefit that lay people and people who are very, far away, who can't come up to Chōzen-Ji every day, can benefit from. And then what exactly those mechanisms are. What I've come to in these sort of my initial thinking it through is that fundamental reframing of just like, how do I want to live my life? The trouble is that if, say, I've always been a kind of intense person and I like doing things full on and being adventurous and trying new things. But I always got the feedbacks like, oh my God, Cristina, you're so intense. Just like, stop. and but it's my nature. And it's also from that perspective of building spiritual strength, really beneficial. So, there are like little things that maybe as part of this reframe, I think can be helpful. And I want to acknowledge too that like, maybe they might create situations where people are like, yo, can you just wash the dishes? Like, you don't have to be so intense while you wash the dishes. But that is one of the things I recommend. One of the things that we do here is we wash the dishes, but in a particular way. So we'll be serving like 10, sometimes I'm cooking for 10 people, 3 meals a day plus a snack for weeks on end. But if you went into the kitchen 20 minutes after the meal was over, you would never know that a meal had been served in there, because we wash and dry all the dishes and we put them away every time we use them. And it's this intense, it feels like a NASCAR pit stop. We've got one person who's soaping, one person who's rinsing, and you're using really hot water, like as hot as you can stand, because it makes you do it fast so you don't waste water. The heat also makes the dishes dry faster. And then it also is like, you got to pay attention. It's so hot. You're like, how little water can I use so that my fingers don't get burned, but I still get this dish totally clean. And then there are several people actually who are drying and putting away. And I think people can do that at home. It's actually technically more sanitary to let the dishes air dry, but the drying and the putting away and that satisfaction of the feeling of like, oh, it's all taken care of. You would never know a meal had been served. And there's a sense of completeness. I did the whole thing. There's also just like a full engagement when you approach even mundane and day-to-day tasks that way. Like, what if I just did it and I forced it in ways that made me fully pay attention? So I'm not, thinking about other things as I wash the dish or as I vacuum. But this is, so what I was getting to earlier is I know that if you live with other people, they might be like, I just want to wash the dishes and leave them there, and it can create conflict. But if you have the opportunity to find those places in your life, it might be through exercise, but then it's also like they're discrete. So one of the wonderful things about martial arts is that, you can go completely, you can be totally going after another person, or someone's coming after you and they just keep hitting you. And you feel like they're being a jerk. But then at the end of the class, or even the end of the keiko, the practice, you bow to each other and it's over. So the preventing burnout part is like making sure these things are discrete and they're complete. There's a starting point, there's an end point, and there isn't this bleed over into like, I need to do this every moment, every day. And probably the most draining thing that leads to the most burnout is if there's a second wheel of thought that's always going in your head of, I should be more productive. I have these other things that I need to do. I feel so tired. I'm so burned out. I don't want to burn out. So it's like silencing that most of all, which is facilitated by, nope, this is where I'm in control to do this in this discrete activity. And when I do it, I'm going to do it 100%. I'm not thinking about anything else. and I'm approaching it, you could say, if you want to be dramatic, I'm engaging it like it's life and death. I'm washing the dishes like it's life and death. And then you really you start building this muscle memory, this ki memory of like, I know what it feels like to just do something completely and then feel like at the end, I gave it my all. I have no regrets. I don't feel like I left anything on the table. And then that second wheel of self-doubt and rumination and worry, just like gets a little, there's one less spoke to put on that wheel. So those are some of the places that I would start. It really depends on the person and what the makeup of your life is. But if there are ways that you can find discrete start and end points where you can be fully engaged and then have it be over and not feel like you left anything on the table, no regrets, that's a very good starting point.
Wonderful answer. Go ahead, Noah. And I have one question from John Paul after him.
Hi, first off, thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. I'm curious if, kind of speaking to what Jin just, part of her question, it sounded like you had a lot of different causes that you worked towards in the past. And I'd be kind of curious to know if you have any particular thoughts on sustaining motivation through very trying times, and if you've, it also is, I guess, also a two-part question, and what your current pursuits might be in terms of current causes and what you view as big ones today. Seems like at times there's a lot that need attention, and it can be hard at times to find or focus it on just a few.
Thanks for that. I think my answer to both questions are connected. The most important thing that we can learn to do is to really pay attention to the conditions of our environment and the times that we live in. This is something that we talk a lot about when we're studying Sun Tzu's Art of War here at Chōzen-Ji, that like there are the 5 factors that Sun Tzu identifies. The first one is, are you a person of the Tao? Which I always struggle with, because it's like, does that mean that I can't even start to think about strategy if I'm not yet a person of the Tao? Or is it enough that I'm like trying to be a person in accord with the Tao? But that's someone, who's in training, who's pushing themselves in that way on a path of spiritual development. That's how I figure it. The second is to look at the weather, and that in the Warring States period literally meant the weather. Is it the rainy season? You're not going to try to move troops in the middle of the rainy season or monsoon. But for us, it can also mean, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the pandemic, anything that dictates sort of what the energy is and what's possible in a given space, what people have energy for. Then there are things like terrain. That's the third factor. And we have it even in our English language, like if something is an uphill battle versus, there are different ways that the terrain, what we're trying to do and the obstacles that are going to be in our way to get there determine, whether a battle is worth fighting. And then there are things like command. Then you start talking about actually who's the right person to do the thing that you're trying to do, and then what's the strategy or the tactics for it. But we tend to think about strategy from a social change perspective, or from even the perspective of where do we put our attention, backwards. We think about tactics first, and then people, and then we ask whether it's doable in this terrain, and then we think about the weather, or the broader social political conditions. So that in and of itself, there are a lot of lessons in the art of war actually for sustaining ourselves in life when times are really hard and challenging. Another one is in the art of war, he says, no nation has ever benefited from a sustained conflict. And by sustained, he generally means more than 100 days, more than 3 months. One teacher I know says, if the earth can't even sustain a season for more than 3 months, what makes you think you can sustain a whole campaign for longer than that? So there are things like that that I think kind of getting back to that, like, why is it so important that we question our motivation and our starting point as people who want to create change? When my motivation was that I want to be right and I want to do the right thing, everything else went out the window. I didn't read the weather, didn't read the terrain. I was ready to throw myself over the cliff. And it wasn't necessarily the right, and you know, and burn it all down in the process. It wasn't necessarily the way to achieve my goal and my aims. So that, I would say, you know, it can come across as like, be driven less by your emotions, or like, don't let your emotions be so in control. But it really is like a combination of sensitivity and paying attention, and yeah, less about being righteous and about what's right, and being pretty practical about like what's actually doable. And the most significant, probably like the important teaching in the art of war, is that the party that has the longer timeline is always going to be victorious. And you have the long timeline of, you know, creating peace and harmony, then it doesn't really matter as much if you win this, if you lose this battle. It might actually be advantageous to your ultimate goal if you're looking 30 years down the horizon versus 30 days. Less reactive, and you might, you know, have a different approach to things. And that certainly is going to impact like your burnout and things like that. Right now for me, I did speak out on, you know, as part of the movement for anti-Asian violence, and there I feel like drawn to talking specifically about spiritual institutions and religious traditions that came out of Asia and that have been really extracted from their cultural and historical contexts, particularly like with the mindfulness movement and sort of the, you know, very people painting with a broad brush, saying that everyone should do meditation and stuff like that, but maybe not in the context of any training in ethics or community, or just the sort of practical aspect of what that looks like in your life, and cultural grounding that can facilitate more understanding and realization. So, and knowing that that can have a lot of broad implications in a lot of different places, partly because people are looking for meaning, spiritual practices, whether it's in ritual or meditation, to try to help in their lives. That's sort of where I feel called to these days, is figuring out like, okay, how do I help reframe this for people so, you know, their meditation or their spiritual practice isn't just facilitating their burnout or a short-term, like, myopic sort of view of how to create change in the world, or maybe making us like overly sensitive without the spiritual strength part, so that we feel overwhelmed and kind of fall apart.
Thank you so much. I have a question from John Paul, who doesn't have a mic or camera, so I'm asking on behalf of him. How does the dojo of the potters will relate to your practice? And can we bring the dailiness of the monk as at home dailiness, like mundane?
I didn't talk about the hara, so I'll talk about it right now briefly. In Japanese, the hara refers to the area below your navel and actually wraps 360 degrees all the way around. And in almost any martial arts, you're always trying to cultivate strength in your hara. The idea being that the mind is kind of well, how do I say this? Just if you have strength down here, you're more grounded. It often accompanies having maturity. I could speak for a whole hour about the hara, so I don't want to get too far into it. But developing the hara has a really big impact on your cultivation of your strengthening of your ki, your fighting spirit, your spiritual strength. And it is a physical and a physical. So when I do ceramics, every piece that I make is a really good indicator of like what's the state of my mind and how set was my hara. And then from a very rudimentary standpoint, just learning to center the clay was really great from a hara exercise standpoint, because I spent the first 6 months just getting pushed around by the clay instead of being able to just center it. I think in Japanese they even say like kill the clay, because you have to like impose your will on it, otherwise it'll go in all sorts of directions. But for centering the clay, for me it came from the strength, learning to have the strength not come from my arms and tightness in my shoulders or my back, but have it come from my hara, from the center, which happens to also be the seat of one's vital energy below the belly button. And then the way we approach ceramics here is also very old-fashioned. So we'll do some basic exercises to coordinate the breath, posture, and even use the voice in learning the basics of how to center and cone the clay and make a very basic form like a cylinder. And then you do that 10 times. Every time you sit down, you cut every single one in half. You don't get to keep anything. And then finally, when you can do that, you'll take a very simple form that's like something standard out of a library or collection that we have. And then you make 100 of them. And it's very different from a traditional like potter studio where, you would go in and do kind of whatever you want. And there's whimsy and there's creativity. And sometimes the clay wants to do something else. And it's not a vase, it's a pot or it's a bowl. But our training is in the discipline of, can I replicate, can I bring the same energy to everyone? Can I just make this form 100 or 1,000 times? So, and then when you've made 1,000, you can be considered as having mastered that form. So I'm still working on my first 1,000 of a particular kind of bowl, a very shallow bowl, but I got a long way to go. And then, the dailiness and the simpleness of monastic life. I think so, because I'm living this kind of hybrid life where I live at a temple and monastery, but I still work and I'm very engaged with the world. I think by virtue of that being possible, it's possible to integrate into a layperson's life. Probably the most surprising thing about the lifestyle and what it feels like to live here, I've had friends who come out and say, I know everyone thinks that you've got this really chill life as a monk and it's really calm and serene, but you have the most intense life out of anyone that I know. Especially when we have live-ins who are here training, when we're responsible for them 24 hours a day, and I'm cooking them meals, and someone's got a blister, and someone's having a breakdown, and someone's got to figure out what task they should be on next. And it's just at every moment of every day, the sense of responsibility and responsibility to the training and the integrity of the training itself as well. So it is really intense and just packed full every day. So if that's the question of like, my life feels really hectic or like there's a lot going on, how can I make it feel more monk-like? I'd say it mostly starts from just like, how do you approach each activity and that sense of full engagement with everything that you're doing. It's really challenging in today's world when, the pursuit of perfection is not something that it's something that people think is unhealthy. But from a Zen perspective, it's like, yeah, try be perfect. Try and make a perfect pot. Why not? Go for it. Try have a realization. Why not? Meditate all night. Go for it.
It's very Japanese too, Jeff has the hand up. Go ahead.
Cristina, thank you for your really very sincere and very sensitive and heartfelt talk and answers. I have a trinity of questions, and they go like this. Why do you do Zazen? how do you deal with reactivity with so many things in the monastery and in this world? And the third question, in this world of duality, how do you deal with really learning to perceive really what is as it's happening? And how do you accept reality as it is when so many things happen that you just don't like? What is Zen? How do you deal with emotions? How do you accept reality as it is and deal with the perception as it's happening, knowing that what is, you can't change it, but that ego doesn't accept reality. How do you work with those questions? And I ask you that first question. A friend of mine who practiced for many years as Zen, was a longtime Tai Chi student, knew it at a martial arts level. As she was dying, said to me, Jeff, why do we sit? And her daughter interrupted that answer and dialogue, and I just wasn't able to complete with Margaret. And you're the first person I think I've asked that question since she passed on about 10 years ago. And I know that's a lot to answer, but take your time and please be as comprehensive as you can. Give it to us as honestly as you can, just like you've been sharing.
Oh,
Take that pot, and you know what I'm saying.
I do.
Please, I would be grateful.
Omori Sogen, this gets thrown around a lot. I feel a little bad throwing it out there because it's kind of pithy, but you know, Omori Sogen, Roshi would say, the point of doing Zazen is Zazen. Which is to say we can't reduce it to, I do it for this outcome or for this reason. And then you start to get to enlightenment is training and training is enlightenment. Life is training, training is life. I think if we do any of these things, you know, you should be motivated and push yourself. You have to have that great determination. It's part of that tribe. Great faith, great doubt, great determination. It's part of Zen, you know, approaching any spiritual endeavor. But if it's to achieve a specific outcome or goal, you know, we're just tying one hand behind our backs. The reactivity and dualism, they're kind of, for me, the, you know, the things we don't like, they're kind of the same. The answer to both questions is the same, which is what worked for me was to have this physical approach to Zen, to approach them through the body. I spent maybe about 12 years in like Theravada circles and insight meditation and Goenka Vipassana, and kind of, you know, trying to find my Sangha and my teacher in a lot of different places. And a lot of the approach I encountered was very conceptual. Sutra study, ideas. But what was most powerful for me from the beginning, my very first Vipassana retreat, which I didn't realize was like the reason that it was really effective for me, just individually, until I got to Chōzen-Ji, it was the physical aspect of it. Because in the Goenka Vipassana retreats, they have these sittings of strong determination where it's an hour and you don't move. You don't open your eyes, you don't open your hands, you don't open your legs. And 8 to 10 hours of meditation a day, it's just excruciatingly painful. So similarly, you know, at Chōzen-Ji, we sit 45 minutes at a time. In total, Monday through Friday, 2 hours and 15 minutes a day. During session, it's more like 8 to 10 hours a day. And in none of those sessions do you move. Are you allowed to move? And if you do move, you might get yelled at. You might get thrown out of the dojo. It feels really serious. And the reason that it's so serious is because, one, the integrity of the method, but also, more importantly, like, I have no idea why someone is in the dojo and why they've come to this kind of training. It might be because the person they love most in the world is dying. It might be because they're facing a challenge that they feel totally incapable of facing. who am I to, they chose to do this, I chose to do this. It'd be really shitty if I like took that away from them and I moved because I was uncomfortable in the city. And there's some scientific research out there about pain, physical pain, most notably that the same or similar regions in our brain are activated when we experience physical pain as emotional pain. So, you know, not to romanticize pain or not because we seek it out, you know, but it's been my greatest teacher. I sit there, my knee is on fire, my ankles hurt so much. All I want to do is move, to the point where like, I really don't know if I can keep doing this. And then the deep relaxation that can sometimes come about because I have no choice except to find some way to get through it. Or that fundamental sort of like question that can then arise of who's feeling the pain? Who's that? So one time I was sitting there in Zazen, I think it was during sesshin. I'd heard all these stories about, there's this old teacher here, and he was starting out training in his early 40s, which is pretty late, just especially from a physical standpoint in our tradition. And he was sitting sesshin when Omori Sogen was overseeing sesshin in the early days. And Omori Sogen is his master swordsman, right? Oh, this teacher, he talked about, he just felt like he was dying like a rat in sesshin. And he thought to himself, when Omori Sogen Omori Roshi was walking, doing the inspection of all the students, he said, if he had a real sword in his hand right now, I would give him my neck and just say, just end it. I can't do this. It hurts so much. And something about that, it actually, as Omori Sogen was walking in front of him, he stopped. He just felt the intensity of what he was going through, and then he kept walking. So I had heard this story a bunch of times. Oh, you're going to die like a rat in sesshin. You're going to want to die. You're going to think you're dying. And I sat there in sesshin, and there was a very like dramatic little voice in me that's like, oh, I'm going to die. And then just as fast, this other voice came up and said, so die then. And I was like, oh, never mind. Keep going. I didn't mean it. I wasn't sincere about it. And then another time, this, you know, saying to myself, oh my God, it hurts so much. It hurts so much. And then this just same voice, my own voice coming back and saying, well, you're alive, aren't you? It's like, oh yeah, the pain is a signal to me that I'm alive. And it's actually, I could only have this pain if I were alive. And that makes it kind of precious. And what can I learn from it? What can I do with it right now? So it's like, you have to ride that balance of like not being attached to it and seeking it out and being masochistic. But it's like when it does arise, you know, there's a lesson and there's value in there. And just the physical training of again and again being in that circumstance of like, there are these external conditions that, I mean, it's the same thing. My body hurting is the same as there are external conditions, like things happening in my life that feel unfair or not right or that I don't like. But I have my breath. I have my posture. I can see 180 degrees. I can see the whole room. I have my concentration. I can get through this. I can stay focused on what's important. So that's what I found.
Great questions and great answers. Really fascinating. If you don't have any other questions, may I ask something? The word ki, I think you translated as fighting spirit. Is that right? Or
It's like one aspect of it, but it's a pretty narrow,
okay.
view of it. It is more the energy vibration, energy signatures, and kind of a maybe more expansive way of understanding it.
Mm.
But you honestly would have a better understanding of it as a Japanese
Oh,
person.
I was just wondering because the word, you know, in kanji means merging of energies. You know, so that's when you go, ah, you know, in kendo, you're just trying to merge your energy with the sword, you know, so you be one, right? I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's what it is. And so when I heard that word, the phrase fighting spirit or fighting the self, overcoming the self, and juxtaposing that with the concept of winning the conflict without fighting, kind of, I felt kind of a little bit contradictory. To me, like fighting conjures up this image of dualism. I'm fighting against something. So when I'm sitting, I'm not fighting with my small mind or fighting with this physical pain, you know, try to overcome, you know, because I won't win. I'm, you know, my mind is very, very small and I'm very weak. So there's no way I can win or overcome it. But when I kept practicing for the purpose of just letting go, just let go of, oh, pain, okay, there's pain. And then let it pass and there's still pain, I'm feeling it. But I kind of changed my perspective. Well, the pain keeps me awake, you know. So then it's not painful, like I'm, you know, it's not my enemy anymore. So I'm not fighting the enemy. I'm not fighting myself, my small self, but I'm just like letting go, you know, until, and maybe waiting till this big mind is here finally. And you might go again, you know. I'm just wondering about your perspective more. I want to hear a little bit more of that, you know, because you do have to fight the enemy when you're doing Budō. So inherently there's a dualism, right? The other. But then you're trying to be one with it, with the act, with the actions. And so it's so complicated, but I just want to hear more about that from you.
I think you're trying to be one with the other, with the opponent too. You're trying to transcend the dualism of that self and other. What your comment made me think of from like a visual metaphor standpoint is that story, you know, of the samurai on the bridge. Samurai stands on a bridge and it's enemy in front of him, enemy behind, and raging waters below. If he jumped off the bridge, it would be to his death. And then his training is to still just go forward without survival. Survival is not the goal. Is the act going forward. And there's the transcendence of the dualism of life and death that's in that. But one has to have ki and a certain, fighting spirit, you're right, is not a comprehensive or like a satisfactory term for it. Maybe it was just one that made sense and worked for me. That feeling of, I'm not going to give up. I'm just going to go. I mean, I think from a different perspective, even just the word sincerity, majime in Japanese, like could be another way of saying the same thing. Of, I'm really going to approach this, engage it, even if it's a calligraphy, making a pot, like it's a matter of life and death. That kind of, I'm not going to let myself get pushed off the goal or the objective, or to feel like, oh, it's too hard and so I'm going to give up. Maybe that is more an expression of where I was starting from, you know, as someone who when I wasn't being really strident and like leading campaigns and doing this sort of advocacy work, I was kind of a quitter. And I would quit things because it was just like too challenging or too annoying or onerous. And I would, particularly as someone who was really good at picking up things, picking up languages, picking up different disciplines and arts, like I would learn them quickly. But then when it got to the point where I actually had to really practice and try to develop technical skill at something, that's usually when I would quit, like as a kid when all these different activities are in school. And so that fighting spirit for me was relevant because I needed to fight myself, my own ego, and my desire to just not do that thing that was hard. But I liked the, you know, when that young man said he realized he needed to fight, that just felt really meaningful for me because he, you know, there was maybe a dualistic nature to it of my anxiety as an enemy to fight, creating a dualism there. But the good part to it was that he didn't see the anxiety as himself. You know, maybe at that point there was less of an attachment to it's my anxiety. This is just how I am. It's part of me. I can't undo it. Not be anxious. He had this moment of like, you know what? I want to try to just overcome this. And it was the first time that he, you know, that was the framing that worked for him and that worked for me of like, yeah, I don't want my life to be controlled by this anymore. This habit.
Thank you. I have one more question though, if I'm just wondering what led you, maybe you said this and I missed it, but what led you to Zen of all things? I mean, you said you tried Theravada, you know, Vipassana, meditation, and other. Were you just trying different methods and to find what clicks with you, or?
Yeah, I was searching. Yeah, you probably know the 10 ox herding pictures of wandering over, what is it, interpenetrating paths and unnamed rivers and about to collapse and you haven't found the way, you can't find the ox. That's what the first 12 years was like. I was just searching and searching and I just knew this isn't it, this isn't it, this isn't it. And I tried the best that I could every step along the way to gain understanding. And there were sparks of, you know, small breakthroughs that happened. Coming to Zen though was like totally a fluke, and I would say it wasn't just Zen alone because I did have some exposure to other sects and schools and teachers, but it was, you know, this place Chōzen-Ji specifically that was like, this is it. And I knew almost the minute that I walked through the gate, this is it. And it was very synchronistic. It was very, you know, a lot of different conditions aligned so that I could be here. I happened to hear from my very old friend who started training in Zen a little before I started doing Buddhist meditation through Vipassana, Goenka Vipassana. He had started training up. Then he moved in here as the resident priest 4 years ago. He sent me an email and said, I know you're still into Buddhist meditation. We're trying to get more people to come up here and experience this. And I was like, I literally just agreed to meet someone in Hawaii in 3 months. So I guess I'll see you in 3 months. And then it was just this succession of all these different things that, you know, when I look back on it, was a little embarrassing. Like, oh God, I was so numb. I couldn't like connect all the dots. Here were all these different people that I met in different ways that Chōzen-Ji like came up in my life. And I just didn't see the connections and didn't make it out here until about 3.5 years ago. And then that was it. And it was really the physical approach, the unbroken lineage, this is the first time I'm in a Buddhist Sangha where not that this is the be all and end all. And I don't mean for this to be like super political, It's the first time that I'm like surrounded by a bunch of people who look like me. And being in Hawaii is wonderful because of like the mishmash of cultures and ethnicities here. I've actually learned more about being Korean being in Hawaii than I did anywhere else, and mostly from not Korean people. But people who like recognize things that I do and like, oh, that's so Korean. I'm like, oh, it's not just me. But no, it's just a lot of things aligning. Is more the approach, it's the place, it's the culture, and it's the energetic, the signature, the kiai is the right match for me.
Wow, I envy you that you found a home. Great. David has a question. Hi, David. He works for Homeboy Industry.
Hi.
Moon. I've been joining you all from the road. We're going across. I'm in somewhere central California. It's about 100 degrees. But I just wanted to express my deep gratitude, many bows for such a definitely provocative and inspiring and very moving talk. Just every time I hear you, Reverend Moon, it's just not only because you're been joining us from Hawaii, where I call home. It just I feel deeply more connected and have a greater sense of purpose. And I understand why I identified with the sort of kind of maybe provocative nature of the kind of the spirit of using kill and fight, also kind of being from Homeboys and my own background, and I greatly appreciated that. I think also in the context of the Stop Asian Hate, where Asians have been, or in my own experience as well, been treated as the silent and passive minority. It's felt very empowering to sit in your talk and listen to you. So just wanted to express my gratitude. Thank you, and happy belated birthday as well. So, yeah.
It's so nice to meet all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Myoshin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was quite beautiful, more than beautiful.